Hello everyone, welcome to 100 Stories Deep. My name is Arron Gill and today I'll be reading from Zadie Smith's Grand Union, a collection of short stories, and I'll be reading the story Kelso Deconstructed. And I've chosen this story in particular because I think it's a useful story to help us process things that are happening in the world at the moment, particularly thinking about racial justice and black justice and systemic racism against black people. So yeah, this is Kelso Deconstructed by Zadie Smith. The people are Kelso and Olivia, a couple. The setting, a shabby rented room on the Bevington Road in Portobello. It was Kelso's room until 5 weeks ago, when Olivia moved in. Kelso is from Antigua originally. He is a carpenter. Olivia is a trainee nurse from Jamaica. They are engaged to be married, although they will never marry. By the time the next sentence arrives, it will be Saturday, the 16th of May, 1959, the last day of Kelso's life. One thing about the last day of our lives is we almost never know that is the last day. From here stems dramatic irony. And no more did Kelso know it. His mind was full of the pain in his thumb and the heat in the room. The break was unusual. Low down in the final joint, underneath the doctor's makeshift splint, he could feel the bones still moving. The pain was hard to bear, somehow shameful. He didn't want to bore her complaining about her thumb, nor be unable to open a window while she looked on, but the frame had been painted carelessly. It was sealed shut. There seemed to be no moving it. She stood at his shoulder, desperate for air on a sweltering afternoon. Kelso put down his palms to the sash and braced himself. Perhaps you should just call this Mr. Reynolds and ask him. Oh, I will, Livy. Certainly, I will. They both knew he'd do no such thing. Reynolds considered himself a saint for renting to them in the first place. Plenty wouldn't, and never lifted a finger on any account. Not even for the Irish on the second floor. Now, as Kelso bent his knees a little to get more purchase on the frame, and Livy begged him not to bother with it, his right hand slipped, bumping the thumb against the lock. His moan was long and pitiful. Bent over himself, he watched her step forward and force the sash. Little flecks of dry paint went flying to the carpet and the air moved a little, not much. Oh, strong woman I'm marrying. If you want to see true muscle, go and see my Auntie P in Dalton. She'll pick you up, high up. If you think I'm strong, you don't know. See? Maybe I proposed to the wrong Miss Ellington after all. But wait 1 minute. What does this Auntie P look like, I wonder? Olivia cracked up. Broad as 3 men, side by side. I see. Kelso put his good hand around Olivia's waist and leaned into her. They looked out together, over Notting Hill. It was Whitsun Bank Holiday, the hottest day of the year so far, and the streets were relatively empty, excepting the little half-moons of people gathering outside the doors of pubs and the Domino's places on the next corner. He was conscious of the fact that many people were presently boarding trains and coaches on their way to the seaside and other pleasant locations. He could not offer her any of that, but still their Saturdays were precious, as they are to all working people. And when the hammer fell off his thumb in the workshop on Wednesday, that had been his first thought. Let this be brief. Whatever this is about to be, pain, doctors, pharmacy visits, all of that business, Lord, pray let it be done with by Friday night. But all this morning, wandering with Olivia through the Saturday market, as he smiled, as he nodded whenever she pointed out a nice basket or a good-looking mango or a brass carriage clock, his only true thought had been, thumb, thumb, thumb. It was the same when his younger brother Mal came by. His little brother had not neglected to bring the ginger wine. He arrived laden with fresh gossip from back home, and amusing off-colour stories about the factory floor at McVitie's. But Kelso could not get any of the usual pleasure from it. He sat glumly in his chair, his hand very still pressed between his thighs in the armrest, a copy of Reader's Digest open in his lap. It was left to Mal to commandeer Kelso's precious danzonette, upon now which he played half a dozen melancholy jazz standards. "I'll be seeing you. They can't take that away from me. The very thought of you." Each one about loss and death and love, and therefore thematically consistent with what was about to occur. But Kelso, caught in the slipstream of life without the hindsight of either reader or author, could think only of his own pain, which by this point was not stabbing, sharp, or occasional, but radiating, unceasing, and mind-consuming. He let Mal dance with Olivia. He did not sing along or make such comment on anything. He did his best to read the words in his lap. It was a foreign story, Russian, translated and made shorter for the convenience of the working man, and it concerned the death of a lawyer. For this reason, Kelso had turned to it with a special interest. The law was his own aspiration. He had hoped one day to afford to study it. But the story was heavy going. It had come to him by way of a costly subscription, £2 bob for the year, the price of which he tried not to think about too often, because if he did, he knew he would cancel it. The trouble was, it was near impossible to say what point a working man such as himself, for whom every shilling counted, had even done £2 bob's worth of reading. And it was also very difficult to say whether the things you did read, even if you read them cover to cover, every month and for the full year, were worth £2 bob in the first place. Words were obviously not like records or silk handkerchiefs or the sorts of spiffy waistcoats he happened to favour. The only other material on which he had ever considered spending £2 bob. No, words weren't like that. What were they like? They just didn't seem to be any way at all of knowing. He didn't imagine even the rich and educated knew the answer any more than he did. They just didn't miss the £2 bob either way. This particular story he had been reading for a month at least, and freely admitted to himself that he was not really following it. But he still liked it well enough for those sentences that seemed, every now and then, to be about himself. That is, about Kelso, although of course he understood that they actually referred to this mysterious Russian character, Ivan, who lived in a house Kelso could not visualise, in a time and place surely too distant in history to feel real to any reader, be he working man or not. Last week the story had felt especially far from his own reality, almost to the point of being incomprehensible. What he had thought would be a tale of the law had turned out to be more about pain, excruciating pain and miserable death. Each paragraph felt like a swamp you were forced to wade through. Yet now he was in so much unexpected pain himself, he found certain lines shot out to him directly, as if addressed to him only with personal intent. The people around him did not understand or would not understand it, but the thought everything else in the world was going on as usual. Yes, he felt just like that! It was almost 4. A look passed between Olivia and Kelso, which Mal, good-humoured by nature, did not take personally, corking what was left of the ginger wine and tucking the bottle jauntily under his arm. And his brother, who loved him dearly, saw him do this, did not take any offence. You shared what you could and you took back what you needed, for nobody was living like the Queen of England over here, were they? Well, I'll be seeing you, Kel, man, said Mal. He would not. Not ever again. But wasn't to know. Kelso, for his part, was not eager to move his hand from its rigid position and left the goodbyes to Olivia. Who gave her almost brother-in-law a kiss on each cheek, or closed the door behind him and then took her place in the armchair next to Kelso. They had 2 chairs. She considered this one of the many advantages of marrying a carpenter. What foolish people threw out, Kelso could mend and make good, and Olivia's contribution was a pair of decently sewn slipper covers. And if only the room itself were bigger, they'd have made many more people round to admire their handiwork. She looked over at her love, still reading, clearly in pain. She picked up her sewing basket, a little dutifully. On Saturdays, by mutual agreement, they tried to uplift themselves and not waste the precious hours on too much foolishness. Kelso did his book reading, and she tried to busy her hands in a way that was not labour, that had something leisurely about it. But leisure did not come naturally to her, and if he caught her darning a sock or hemming a curtain, he certainly didn't like it, and let her know that he didn't. Why couldn't she understand that she deserved a weekend as much as any other Londoner? He was especially adamant about her doing nothing useful during bank holidays. So now she passed over the torn skirt that sat on top of her basket and urgently needed her attention, reaching instead for a perfectly pointless piece of embroidery she'd been working on almost as long as Kelso had been reading his digest. It was a pretty oval, text in the middle, and bluebells around the edges, and, if she ever finished, it would sit on the wall above their chairs, a touch of home. Words are to be taken seriously. I try to take seriously acts of language. Words set things in motion. I've seen them doing it. But she had only got as far as the second, seriously, which she now noticed contained a foolish error. It was missing the letter U, and so began, with a little sigh, to unpick it. A few minutes later, Kelso surprised her, raising his knee, letting his book fall shut, standing up suddenly. Livy, the thing is that we must get out of here. It's as hot as the devil in here, and you know, it's not too late. By which she meant they were not too late for Speaker's Corner, where they usually went after Mal had left them. It was part of their weekend of uplifting and betterment. Some people thought of Saturday only as sweet relief as dominoes and rum, but Kelso didn't think that way, and she was glad he didn't. Even if there were times she wished he didn't frown so on going to the pictures. All you will see at the Odeon is advertisements for America, and what I can tell you, I've been to America and it is not at all what it is advertised. Olivia found this sentiment unusual and impressive. At the same time, she never inquired too deeply into his American experience, suspecting from the little things he had said here and there that it had been a moment in his life when the devil was pulling on his collar. But that had been another woman's problem, and a different Kelso. And every Saturday around 5, she had written home to her mother in the letters that contained the news of her engagement. We go to Speaker's Corner down in Hyde Park to hear all the people talking. It was both uplifting and less painful than the Odeon on her pocketbook. Still, her girlfriends thought it was an odd habit. They had no experience of a man with a plan who thought beyond tomorrow, but Kelso was 10 years older than Olivia and her friends, and the difference told. He had learned to save his money. One day he would be a lawyer in a strange white wig. Now she had packed up her bag and put her on her hat and checked her change purse for the train fare. They stepped out onto the hot streets in their shiny shoes, their clean, formal clothes, and she felt a certain pride. Going to the corner of a Saturday was like everything else. It was like the way she and Kelso dressed, the way they walked, their careful precision of their habits. All these things marked them out in her mind as a special couple with a special destiny. The man in front of them was old and white, quite bald, with only a little grey hair on each side and dark furry eyebrows. Evidently a French poet. He stood on a simple slatted box, the kind used to transport those fruits that fall ill at the least lack of air. And he peered into the crowd with interest, as if trying to discern what type of audience this might be at his feet. This suggested to Olivia that there were people This suggested to Olivia that there was more curiosity than authority about him. She liked people like that. Kelso himself was like that. The thing is about narrative, said the speaker on the crate, is that it is inherently inauthentic. It is prearranged information in a certain pattern. It will always have a motive. It will always be manipulative. Look at his bushy eyebrows, cried a foolish woman behind Olivia. Doesn't he just look like a snowy eagle? Oh, hush up and listen, said Olivia, but under her breath without turning around. If you listen, you might even learn something. Kelso restricted himself to sighing and looking up with renewed scholarly intensity at the curious figure on the crate. And if this manipulation, the Frenchman continued, if it comes from the right, well then we call it propaganda. And if it comes from the left, we tend to consider it not only humane, but beautiful. We think of literature as humane and beautiful. It matters very much who the we is in this preposition. I am a French poet. I do not include myself in that we. And would it not be better to place humane and even the human on one side to the moment, to deal with only material facts? To say, with me, like the darkness, the streetlight, the stiletto knife, the puncture, the wound, the blood, the cobbles, the tarmac, the curb. You see, the speaker went on like this for some time. It was a hot day to be near so many other bodies listening to such a forceful oration. Kelso and Olivia were familiar with oration, but they were not accustomed to the heat, not at least here in England, where they learned to wear sweater vests and cardigans with everything, no matter what the early morning sun on their window panes implied. Now each stripped off a layer, with Kelso hung over his left arm, crooked to a 90-degree angle, and found that elevation helped the pain. Olivia, tiring a little of the French poet, turned her attention to the American voice on her left, which turned out to be a woman, not unlike her own grandmother, the same lion's face and same wealth of hair. The function, said this woman, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again the reason for your being. The reason for your being, thought Olivia, and gripped Kelso's good hand a little tighter. This fresh pressure was a counterbalance to the pain on his other hand, and he could use the one to distract from the other. This worked for a moment. Then the pain re-established itself, more persistent than ever. He could not attend to this woman. He could barely attend to anything. At 6:15, a great flock of swallows took flight from the top of the marble arch and swept over the crowd, so low that many crouched, including most of the speakers, after which everybody straightened up again. The speakers carried right on speaking. The tricky thing became knowing when to leave. Neither Kelso nor Olivia wanted to be the one to say, "Let's go." They had to place the decision outside of themselves, in the weather or some external cause, for to leave was to give upon betterment, or suggest betterment was less than the pictures, or the market, or the million other fun, easier things. "How's your thumb? It pain you still?" asked Olivia, in a sudden leap of inspiration. He was holding his left hand to his chest, with his right like someone about to say something terribly sincere, an oath, or maybe a profession of love. "Oh, Livy, it's murder!" They walked back to the station. At the entrance, a newspaper boy was changing the hoarding poster from today's headline. Signs and symbols to tomorrow's foreshadowing. Kelso stopped, rolled a thin cigarette, and lingered a while so to read the front page, which this particular lenient newsboy, and they were not all like that, did not stop him from doing. As the boy busied himself cutting the strings off several towers of the Daily Express, Kelso read of the venality, poverty, crime, corruption and murder. Madness. Madness everywhere, he murmured, feeling almost as sorry for the world as he did for his mangled thumb. "Kel, the train soon come!" An old woman sat opposite them. She had a pink scarf tied over her grey curls, too much powder on her nose, and a look on her face that she wished them both dead. Olivia thought, "Oh Lord, even if I hated anyone that much, I wouldn't want to look that way, look as if I did." How ghoulish this woman looked, snarling like that. Almost like Enoch himself. Olivia turned to Kelso to see if he'd noticed, but his head was bowed. He held his wrist as if to cut the blood from the offending hand so that he might feel nothing at all. Olivia raised her own gaze, fixed to the illustration of the Piccadilly line, choosing to focus on the names of the stops. Cade, Bamborough, Ponge, Tolstoy, Morrison, mouthing them silently to herself. Finding this calmed her, and at the next station the ghoulish woman got off. By the time they got home it was past 8. They walked through a summer rowdiness, music from every pub, women dressed as they shouldn't be, drunk lads revving up their mopeds, and Olivia was more ready for her bed. The heat in the room was stifling. She hung her coat and hat on the little hook Kelso had fashioned for the purpose, turned her back and found him pacing his small space, his coat still over his arm. His hat crushed his good hand. She watched him dump his small change out on the table where it could serve as evidence against a botched robbery. He took another turn around the room, moaning. "You want me to go with you?" "No, Livy. No point 2 people waiting in a waiting room when only one is sick." She put his hat back on his head, warned him she might be asleep by the time he got back. It was already mostly drunks in St. Mary's and ragged, homeless white people, the existence of whom still very much surprised him even after 5 years in this country. He sat slightly apart from them all, his thumb pressed between his knees. An hour went by. A nurse called him into a small corner, marked off with curtains on a rail. She undid the bandage and the splint and showed him the correct way to hold the throbbing joint until a Dr. Rooney arrived. Another hour passed. Then a surprise. A woman. Livy claimed that there were 2 women doctors at her hospital, but he had never seen an example for himself. This one was alarmingly young. Her pale ears poked through her poker-straight hair. She looked like a schoolgirl. He asked her if that was an Irish name, and she nodded, but said nothing more. She took his thumb, pressed it between her own thumbs to align it, then set it in a fresh splint, with a fresh bandage, and all the time speaking very little to him, but going about her business with a serious intent and also a delicacy Kelso admired. She did not look at him. For example, when he yelped, as she worked, he watched her. He wondered whether he himself could have been a doctor had he been dealt very different cards. What she was doing did not seem so very distant from carpentry. "There you are," she said, and smiled for the first time. She passed Kelso her prescription. It was formatted strangely, like an email from one writer to another. From youngiriswriter@gmail.com to older Englishwriter@yahoo.com. Not having any academic background in creative writing, I never really understood the injunction, show, don't tell. But now I think it's communicating the same basic concept, that there are some ideas impossible to understand or accept as direct statements, but just marginally, fleetingly comprehensible in the form of stories. At times I do wonder if there's something slightly dishonest in this approach, that it turns the novel into some sort of parable or illustration or precept instead of an honest narrative. Kelso took it gratefully. He thanked the good doctor and started for home. He walked down the Harrow Road and over the Grand Union Canal. Water went with water in his mind. The green murky lagoon behind his great aunt's house, where he and his cousins had often picnicked in the black sand and swum in the early evenings, seemed to lie in his mental geography. And at the other end of the channel of water connecting Antigua to this grey canal beneath his feet, and stretching all the way back to the New World, to the Potomac and to the Hudson, both of those so very cold and filthy. Perhaps if he had lasted longer in the States, or in that bad American marriage, he might think of white sands and warm waves, but all his American water had been on the East Coast. Stacking shipping containers at Vesey Street might put a man off of water for life, he supposed. Yet without water you could not be reborn, and daring to cross an ocean one more time had been his own form of rebirth, a second baptism. He had tried America, then he had tried England. How many could say that? And he was still standing despite many setbacks and missteps. He felt he knew his own worth. Livy knew it all. Mal knew it. The lads at work knew it. No, he wasn't like the Russian gentleman in his story, unloved, disrespected. And it was a shame to have such an idea walking home alone. It was really very silly and morbid. He turned his mind to Olivia. He considered the whole back line of her body and how he would soon press onto it and sleep, feeling less pain than he'd experienced these past 4 days. Oh, if there was anything wonderful about pain, it was the moment you stopped feeling it. When feeling nothing became its own incredible gift. And in a few more days, God willing, he'd be back there in that place, with everyone else, in the land of nothing, of no pain. Yet, if he could only wipe those American years, that woman, the wrong path, the years wasted. But that was the kind of pain you just had to live with. He'd given everything on this earth to be 21 again, to step into the river of time with Olivia. But have them both be the same age, and have everything else exactly as it was now, except with those years lost rolled tight into his fist, not yet unravelled. He was walking back, just as he was walking back from St. Mary's. He was minutes away from his door. It was just after midnight. There was white youths. They liked to make trouble for spades. They had been drinking. They were not affiliated with Mosley's crowd in any official capacity. They'd just left a fight at a party. Some of them became career criminals and went to jail for years later, for crimes presumably considered more serious by the state, like robbery, fraud. Many stayed in the area and died in the neighbourhood, unmolested by the law. The ones who did it, who held the stiletto knife and did the stabbing, he was 20 at a time, a merchant sailor. He has a name. It was known to the police within half an hour of the event. But he too died, unmolested by the law, living a long, quiet life in the suburbs, in Hillingdon. Ended up as a painter decorator. After his death, his stepdaughter told a newspaper of how he used to smash up her Bob Marley records. If you align his witness statement to the left-hand margin, it reads like a poem. 50 yards up the road, we had sorted out our little argument and turned to go back to the party. When we reached the corner, we saw this black man lying on the pavement, clutching his chest. 2 spades, that's what we call coloured men here, were standing beside him. We decided to get out of it fast. It was not our business. Then we saw how serious it was. We decided to come clean and tell the lot. I had bloodstains on my clothes. For that matter, all my clothes have blood on them. You know, from one fight or another. Old stuff. We fight a lot here. Life is like that in Notting Hill. The police took away my clothes, but I was in the clear. In the poem, all of our British names are used. Black, spade, coloured. But no man appears to claim them. These are not names for Kelso. They are the name of a rather certain kind of malignancy in the brain of Patrick Digby, poet / murderer, whose name, like all proper names, describe him perfectly. Patrick Digby was the man capable of thinking that way and of writing this poem. But a lot of people couldn't write. But a lot of people could write it. It's amazing how many. The possibility of its composition reoccurs at different moments in history in different places. The details change, but the deep structure remains, a form of tragic verse in which the slaughtered man is a kind of object and only the poet keeps his proper name. Kelso's blood spilled upon the poet Patrick Digby. He got it on his knife, on his suit, and it stained too that pair of gentlemen from the diaspora, referred to in the poem, who, upon spotting Kelso, bleeding, out in the street, knelt by his still breathing body, trying to come to his aid. A passing taxi driver took the three men to St. Mary's, where, an hour later, Kelso died. He had no last thoughts. Last thoughts are for bourgeois Russian deathbeds, in comfortable townhouses, where false friends and colleagues take tea in the next room and ponder what vacancies and opportunities your death might afford them. When you are stabbed in the street, that kind of poetry is in short supply. There is what you see, and there is what there is. You are weighed down by facticity. The last word written by the poet Francois Ponge concerned the table he was writing them on. O table, ma console et ma consoleas. Table qui me console, oui, je me considère. The table, the cobbles, the tarmac, the curb. You can watch the Pathé newsreel of Kelso's funeral. Over 1,000 people came. They lined the streets. At some juncture on its long journey to our digital era, the footage of this event lost its sound and became a silent funeral. Without language, without commentary, open to interpretation. To be noted is the great mix of people, black and white, young and old, men and women, as if Kelso's death concerned all these people, as if they were all in relation to it. As if the Contra, the poet, murderer, Patrick Digby, Kelso Coltrane was precisely everybody's business. Alone, a little anxious, not knowing anybody intimately, I shake hands and make small talk with the ministers who stand at the doors of the church, and spend a long time slowly reading and rereading the thought of the day, which is pinned to the parish notice board. It reads, "Action against racial hierarchies can proceed more effectively when it has been purged of any lingering respect for the idea of race. Reverend Paul Gilroy." A young Marxist in dark glasses was wandering around the funeral with a newspaper. He wants to insist on relation. As he moves through the crowd, he is saying, "Brothers and sisters and comrades, don't you see that if you refuse to enter into each other's stories, if you refuse to admit a relation between you, why, then you hand capitalism its finest victory. Sweet music as it is to the foreman, to hear that the blacks and the poor whites and the Irish and the navvies and the skibbies have no relation to each other. They can make no common cause sweet music." The mourners glance shiftily at the Marxist as he moves between them, a cigarette pressed tight between his lips. His socialist rag held front page outwards to his chest. Is it time to hit back? Time to unite? Who decides? What would either course of action look like? In silence, the mourners read the headline and they return to their silent conversations, sometimes frowning a little, or turning away with embarrassed smiles not to make sure of it. An ideology, but certain that a funeral is not quite the place for whatever this is. They have come to mourn a man, a human being, a member of the local community, Olivia's fiancé, Mal's beloved big brother. this young son of Antigua, cut down as the vicar tells the congregation in the prime of his life. The coffin, shouldered by 5 white men, flies past the 2 black ministers and into the hearse. The huge crowd follows on foot, headed to Kensal Rise Cemetery. A black, brown and white column of people, and some stony-faced others chatting and smiling, as if walking behind a float to a carnival. The time for transforming a dead man's word into argument and symbol and history. This moment will surely come. But the mourners think it in bad taste that this young Marxist should ever come here this morning to the funeral of Kelso Cochrane. They have turned from him. They leave him behind. But though I walk with them, still I am curious about the young Marxist, and stop to take a copy of his newspaper when he hands it to me, and stand for a moment in the street, admiring the brazen headline, "All the world is text." So that was Kelso Deconstructed by Zadie Smith, and I just want to share with you maybe some of my reflections on that story. So I think it's quite interesting that from the outset that we know that we're learning about the last few hours, last few days of Kelso's life, and I think it's interesting that rather than to dissipate the tension of the story, it actually opens it up to lots of different possibilities, and how Zadie Smith, she brings in contemporary touches into the story, so like a doctor's prescription that reads as an email, the London tube stations that are named for writers like Tony Kadibambra and Toni Morrison, and that reminds us that racial violence is much a marker of our moment as that which Kelso Deconstructed takes place. You know, that these things are here right now, and that they are embedded in our social structures as well as the things that happen directly to us, like death. It also reminds us that the more things that change, the more things that stay the same as well. So I just want to ask you to maybe, when you're out and about, is to really, look at the world around you, look at the street names, look at monuments, and ask yourself, what is the history of these things, and whose stories are these things telling? Whose right is it to have their story told? Who gets to have their story told? And also, what does that look like in mourning as well? I think it's really interesting about all the people that came out in mourning for Kelso. So how does history rewrite itself? I think that's quite interesting. Okay, yeah. I'm Arron Gill, so if you want to know more, if you want to hear more stories from the 100 Stories Deep series, subscribe using the link below. Alright, till next time. Ta-da.